we actually do have an anechoic chamber at the department, but
Cool.
it's just
Wow. I've never
do
gotten in one
that
of
there.
those.
Yeah, it's you never got in
No, I've
one? Oh
never
my
gotten
gosh.
in an echo chamber. It's for the
Oh, you
listeners
gotta
that,
go in.
yeah, it's like those are like the craziest spaces in the universe. Can you talk about what that is? You probably actually even know how the math works. I don't know how the math works. It's just a bunch of little.
Well, I don't know if I think designing them is probably like, yeah, really complex, but I mean, the general idea is that it's a room where there's no acoustic reflections, ideally.
Love music more. Love music more.
What's good, everybody? Scoobert Dubert here, about to have a great conversation with Nolan Lem. So Nolan's work is honestly super hard to describe because it is this combination of engineering, technology, and music. It's immersive, it's large scale, it's interactive. It's all about the networks of sonic machinery, which, if that sounds nebulous, you gotta listen to the whole podcast because it's so dope. He's premiered his work and research at a number of different spaces, including the Museum of Modern Art, Buenos Aires, and the Danish National Museum of Music. He's got residencies all over the world. He holds degrees in saxophone performance and electrical engineering, and he received his MFA at Columbia University, where he studied at the Computer Music Center. He received his PhD at Stanford, where he studied at the Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics, which is like one of the spots for just like thinking about the way that the brain and music and acoustics all intersect and intertwine. And he's coming to us on this conversation from Copenhagen. Is that even how you say it? That's how uncultured I am. Copenhagen, Denmark. But Nolan is not. Nolan is cultured. Nolan is he's actually super down to earth and really a great conduit for this kind of conversation about something that is very, high-minded and artistic, but also very visceral and human and of this world and able to, kind of sink your teeth into. And so having a foot in both of those worlds as a person, as a musician, as an artist is just so fascinating. So I love the conversation. I think it opened up new avenues as to what music can even be in my mind. Before we get to that conversation, though, I would like to introduce our title sponsor, DistroKid. DistroKid makes music distribution fun and easy. It actually does. With unlimited uploads, and artists get to keep 100% of royalties and earnings. I use it, and you can too. If you go to distrokid.com/VIP/lovemusicmore, all one word, you'll get 30% off. You'll support your career and support the pod. 1 million plus artists rely on DistroKid to get their music onto Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, TikTok, Tidal, Instagram, and all the other major streaming services. They're constantly adding new services, like stuff I have never even heard of, but apparently like, hey, this one's really big in Indonesia. So yeah, I want my music on that. You know what I'm saying? So go to distrokid.com/VIP/lovemusicmore to get your music out there too. And join the party. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Nolan. What's good, everybody? Welcome back to Love Music More. I'm Scoobert Dubert, and I am joined with Nolan Lem. Nolan, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here and chat with you.
I'm so excited to chat, and I mean, you have such an incredibly diverse background of everything that you've done within music, within art, and your studies, and I just can't wait to kind of dig into your journey and tell the people what you've been up to.
Yeah, sounds great.
Awesome.
Yeah, wonderful.
So my first question is, so you started with jazz, was it? And then was that like, how did you get your foot in the door? Just because I want to paint the picture of this entire career arc to, get to where you are today. How did it all begin?
So, I mean, I've always been like a huge jazz fan. I mean, I still am. I actually still play. It's always been a huge passion. So I went to jazz school, University of Miami.
What sparked the interest? What caught you at a young age? Because I think that there are still some people that might even be listening to this show that love music, but still haven't like understood jazz or have like taken that first step to be like, I get it. What was the thing at a younger age that like hooked you into that world?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, to be honest, I can't remember a time in my life when I didn't like it. I think even from a young age, it was something I was just drawn to, and I really loved the sound of saxophone and drums. So at like a really young age, I really wanted to play saxophone or drums. Yeah, I chose saxophone, and
you start with alto or tenor. How did you start with saxophone?
I was starting on alto,
cool,
as one does, and my mom had to beg one of the local music teachers to take a student that was like much younger than they normally take for saxophone. So she went in and like really kind of like harassed him to like, I think I was 9. 9 or 10, and I think normally he take people 12 or older. So,
Hmm.
but I'm really glad she did. So then I got like an early start, I guess. But I played piano since 5, so
Cool.
I play a lot of piano as well.
Nice.
Improvised music in general, and I played
Yeah.
like rock, and I played other things too. I played classical piano.
Hmm.
Jazz was really what was doing it for me, and yeah, that's kind of what led me to go to music school. So
Awesome. Great answer. And I love the focus on improvisation. So from the beginning, you were always drawn to that improvisation and writing live and all that kind of stuff. Yes?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think maybe I get bored easily,
Uh-huh.
or I just ADD or whatever it is, and improvisation is kind of a natural way that I find stimulating and engaging in a way that other music, I mean, I find engaging as well, but
For sure.
just in different ways. So
No, and
yeah.
I totally appreciate that. So you go to music school, focus on jazz, and then do you go from there to touring and touring in Europe and stuff like that, or when do you start kind of taking that jump into professional saxophone player?
So I stayed in Miami for a year after and was just playing gigs. There's a scene down there for, especially for performing musicians and for gigging and whatnot. And then let's see, I'd met a lot of people I still collaborate with now when I was down there. And so I'd met some people at the university that I kind of kept in contact with. And then I had actually moved back to Kansas. I'm from Kansas City.
Cool.
So I'd moved back there, started going to Italy to play with a group with Joe Raymer, who was at UM as well. And he had moved out there. And just because it was really healthy scene in Italy for jazz, they love jazz. There's all
Yeah.
these festivals, kids
Yeah.
and stuff, and it's just really respected. And it's like a wonderful culture and everything. So
Mhm.
that was really a big part in establishing kind of, I guess, early on an interest in doing stuff abroad.
Cool. Yes.
And then we did festivals, and then we got signed to Cam Jazz, which is a Italian jazz label. So we made a couple records with them. But yeah, anyways, in the interim, I had moved back to Kansas. I had actually started going back to school for electrical engineering
Cool.
because I'd kind of started getting into around that same time, I guess more like experimental music, experimental improvised music kind of composition,
Yes.
working with electronics. And then I felt like it was kind of a nice balance between just exploring kind of intellectual curiosities, academic curiosities with kind of things that I could maybe relate to a future in music in some way, doing things like audio engineering or kind of just creative programming in general.
Yes.
So yeah, that's kind of what provoked that.
When you go back to school for electrical engineering and you have that kind of clarity of like, this is what I want out of it, how did you approach your classes? How did you approach kind of like the way you were building your own educational experience for the outcome you were looking for?
Yeah, that's a really good question. To be honest, I think there's a component of doing a degree in engineering that's almost like a safety thing because it is a good degree to have, and that if you need to have a day job or you want to do something that's outside of just making creative work for a living, then you have that.
Yes.
And I felt like it was a nice balance because I think I had known people that were able to kind of get into things in tech, doing research and development in audio that I felt like was interesting, and kind of like a nice balance between the two. So
Yes.
I think I just knew going in that if I could finish engineering school, that it would just open up a ton of opportunities.
Yeah.
And especially as someone that has kind of like a music background, I think especially back then, it kind of differentiated you from other people that normally have those sorts of roles.
Yes.
In a good way.
Was it hard?
Yeah.
Was it hard to go from, such like a right brain to more like a left brain kind of approach to study in academics?
Yeah, it was hard. I mean, I think I was always pretty decent at math, but
Yeah.
just like you haven't been doing that since
Totally.
a long time.
Exactly.
Like it really takes some time to get back into it. And yeah, it was like a struggle because I think when you have this natural trajectory, when you're doing it from like, like a lot of people do straight out of high school.
Right. It's
like
very
much more-
sequential and yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I had to it was a challenge. Yeah, a lot of just doing problem sets and boring stuff. Not always boring. Well, I mean, it was personally challenging and rewarding in different ways. So
I feel like this happens to a lot of musicians as well, where you start to feel like, okay, I want to add in this other skill set as my backup or as my fail safe. and then that ends up creeping into your music and then setting you on a path that you never would have imagined before, or it was only a glint in your eye. So you graduate from this, and then how do you start to establish kind of your next steps in your career, like where you want to go now that you have this new skill set of electrical engineering, in addition to your touring experience, recording experience in Italy, and all of that starting to bundle up and become the person that you are? Where do you go from there in that moment in time? What were you feeling, and how did you, kind of take the next step?
So when I was in engineering school, I was also still getting into more experimental forms of music, I guess, new music and 20th century music composition.
Yeah.
Which was a lot of very technical and sometimes very mathy, let's say. And
any composers or figures that you'd recommend for somebody that might be interested in kind of getting into that world? I know it's like so scary, I think, to a lot of people, or prickly, because they see it and they're like, mathy or new age or not easy listening, so to speak,
Right. I think I was always into the forms of music back then that was technical, but that the technical approaches actually had perceptual outcomes that were interesting. So like I was always drawn to someone like, Ligeti or Xenakis, because I felt like the things that they're doing were not just technical in a purely theoretical way, but they had actually really cool outcomes that were perceivable and meaningful, and as opposed to something that's more just like strict serialism. And
right.
So yeah, I was always drawn to their kind of work in the mid 20th century. And then that kind of initiating a lot of computer music and electronic music. So yeah, I mean, I guess I was kind of getting into that stuff. I also got into analog circuit design.
Cool.
So I was building analog circuits that made audio and kind of designing modular synths. And that was like a huge kind of game changer for me, working with physical computing in a way, and designing things that make sound and interacting with them. And then it was kind of just like a slippery slope before I wanted to make.
Yeah.
I mean, I always feel this way, but it felt like it just a slippery slope before I kind of wanted to make, let's say, stuff that is considered more sound art.
Okay.
Installation-based work or stuff that wasn't necessarily like performance-oriented.
Mm-hmm.
Then yeah, it just kind of concurrent with that, I was interested in a lot of like outgrowths of computer music mixed with improvisation. So yeah, I wanted to go to master's programs, and I was looking at a few, and then I went to Columbia because it was kind of a nice mix between the things that I wanted to do.
And I mean, you have the Computer Music Center too.
Right.
Could you speak on kind of what that is, a little bit of its history? I know that it dates back to like the 50s, kind of, I don't know, the role that it might have had in shaping kind of your career arc as well.
Yeah, it's like a really historic place because it started out as what was it? Columbia Princeton Computer Music Center, because they have like this RCA Mark II, I think, and it's like the first analog synth in the Northern Hemisphere.
Cool.
And
Awesome.
it's actually no transistors, it's all tube amps. So all of the,
wow.
I mean, it's gigantic and it's still there, but it really worked. I guess like at one point it kind of worked, but it's just like when you go into the room, it feels like this alien. I mean, it feels like almost out of a movie, but it's a real.
I love it. Dude, I love that like space age just aesthetic. I want more of that back in totally. The modern era, right? Yeah.
It's also like become the most Instagrammable like thing to as a computer like guy to like go and stand in front of it and take a photo.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, they just have, they have amazing composition programs. So some of the like really, really good composers from around the world go to study there. The Computer Music Center is a part of the School of Music, but it's situated at the School of the Arts building. So you're actually interacting in that building with a lot of visual artists.
Cool.
And so when I did the sound arts program there, it was the first year it started. And I think it's like a really visual arts oriented kind of program, even though people are dealing with sound in some capacity. Mm-hmm. So I think I did start branching out and start making more physical things there.
Yes.
I learned a lot more about fabrication, kind of like computer aided design. And I had an amazing teacher named Douglas Repetto who was teaching there when I was there, and he was just really into kinetic work and got me interested in working with motors and designing things that move. And that was a big turning point for me, was working in that department for sure.
That makes a ton of sense. I'm really curious about your perspective on kind of like digital versus analog. People set them up as these like
opposite poles or something like that. But it seems like in a lot of your work, you were thinking of it just holistically, like how can I use the best of both worlds? How can I, use fabrication in the digital realm to be able to create an analog thing? Could you speak on kind of the philosophy of that a little bit and maybe help break down kind of those walls in people's minds between digital and analog?
To be honest, most of my work that I make now that deals with sound, almost all the time, it's sounds being produced purely just mechanically. So like acoustic sound.
Yes.
So, and I'm using mostly like digital means to carry out the control of things that make sound.
Okay.
Like in my mind, just the work that I'm making, it's never been like a huge distinction, like, oh, this is like a digital synthesizer versus like an analog one. I know people that are really into that sort of thing. And actually now I'm getting more into kind of doing mixed media work where I'm incorporating both, but I just kind of treat them like I would any other sound and any other tool, I guess. I don't do a ton of stuff with just pure analog synthesis anymore.
Yeah.
I guess probably if I ever interact with sound, it's usually through like a coding language, like SuperCollider or Maximus P. And so that would all be, like a digital type of sound output. Yeah, I guess I just don't have a huge stake in the whole the divide.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that, and I like that. It's like use the tool for the goal that you're going for. Like you're talking so much about outputs, and I really appreciate that because I feel the same way as a recording engineer and stuff. It's like I don't really care. It's like I know what I'm trying to get to. Whatever I need to do to get there, I'm gonna do.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'm really curious on ideation. And because I feel like a lot of people will see immersive works or like go to a space and experience, art like yours. But a lot of times they're so removed from process and from idea. They're just seeing, outcome. How do you get your ideas, or how do you kind of like workshop things? Do you have a backlog of ideas? Like how does that kind of process work so that people, when they go and they physically, experience the medium, they can get a little bit of insight into like the process and the flow of how it even came to be?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I guess I'm often inspired by just how something might sound. So it's kind of an inquiry into what's a sound's potential that I might encounter in the real world. I think a lot of my work uses just natural sounds that we don't usually associate with being like musical.
Yes.
But then, so like I'll just be outside walking around and like I'll see like, I don't know, like a branch swing and hit the surface in a certain way, or I don't know what it is, or just like an object that makes a sound. And then I'm like, oh, like I wonder what that would sound like if they were in this rhythm, and we made like a bunch of them. And then I think it kind of marinates for a little while. And then there's a period where I'm not sure if it's actually a good idea or if it's feasible. But I think I've always like, there are things where I'm like, oh, that's a great idea and I want to try it. And then there is a backlog and I'm like, okay, well, to carry out this idea, I need like this funding.
Right.
I need to have this lined up in a way, and other things I can kind of just prototype and figure out much earlier. But I do kind of find there to be like a year-long period where from like an immediate just like first notion of what something might be to actually like starting to even carry it out. And I think it has to do with a lot of things. A lot of the time it's just purely like logistic, but having access to a studio, and I mean, a lot of my work requires a lot of building facilities and stuff that's not easily accommodated by just like going to a residency and whatnot. So like having my own studio and developing that has been really important. I really have been trying to work on the idea of like, oh, well, I get this idea and then like the time it takes shouldn't be a year. I really wish I could like formulate it and carry it out. Like even this piece I'm working on now, it's like, I remember thinking about it like a year and a half ago, knowing I wanted to do it, but it's just taken this long to like start realizing it and whatnot. So it's a long process usually for me.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I also like the value of rumination and kind of like sitting on the idea, because those ideas, they tend to shift and they tend to change and evolve. Just even if you haven't, maybe it's sketching it out on a page, but or it's just in your head over time, you sleep on it a few times and that idea starts to take on a life of its own.
Absolutely. I also think a lot of the stuff that I want to do when I test it out, or the initial idea doesn't always just physically, logistically work. Like because I deal with a lot of stuff that's kinetic and moving.
Yes.
It's not always going to just work in the way that I think. Like I've always wanted to do a piece with like a bunch of the sounds of scissors when you. Just like creating that sort of motion is actually really hard in like a controlled manner. So, that's something where I'm like, oh, well, I would probably need all these resources to do, and like it's maybe not worth it in the end, or it's just like I had to think a little bit differently. But then like going through that process of figuring out how to make this motion with the resources that I have, sometimes I'll change, the work changes, and it's kind of like the work adapts to what I have available and access to.
Cool.
And that's kind of a nice constraint in some ways. So I don't know. I think people could apply that in more like traditional music production settings too, is just not feeling like, oh, you have to create the perfect thing and that based off of what I would have available if everything were ideal, but just kind of allowing the constraints to shape something in a way that still allows it to, allows it to change, but in a way that's actually maybe sometimes cooler.
Great advice.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think ideas can splinter as well, right? Like you can some of my favorite songs end up like birthing two songs, and I really like that because it's like they're like sisters, they kind of like came from the same family tree, but split off somewhere. Yeah, usually due to constraints. Yeah. I've got some big news, everybody. My vinyl record is out. We didn't make a ton of these, so these guys are gonna sell out, and I would love for you to get your hands on one of them because they're so dope. They're so dope. And it comes with a whole bunch of like liner notes and pictures and special stuff, the things that really went into making this record. And I want you to get your hands on it. So go to scoobertdubert.pizza or check out my Instagram for a link, or click the link in the show notes or the bio or wherever you're watching this to pick up your copy. They're going to sell out. We really did not make very many of these, and I want you to have it. It's like a collector's item. So thank you for supporting my music, and I can't wait for you to hear it actually on physical vinyl. Enjoy the rest of the episode. But yeah, I totally hear it. I would love to talk about your flow from there in Stanford, right? Following Computer Music Center in Columbia, then you make the move over to Stanford. Could you talk a little bit about kind of that transition and the goal set and what you were looking to achieve there?
At that point, I was living in New York, and I actually really loved New York and living there. And I was, I wanted to keep making work, but I also at some point thought that being in academia would be a good position to be in. I question whether or not that's true now, but at the time it seemed like the right thing. And, you pretty much need a PhD. And I mean, it wasn't just solely based off of the fact if you want a tenure track position, you have to have the PhD, but it was also that I started doing a bit more with kind of programming and signal processing to a certain extent. And Stanford, there's a department there called the Center for Computer Research and Music and Acoustics, but everyone calls it CCRMA. So I did my PhD there, and it's just like a really interesting interdisciplinary department where people are doing everything from DSP to music cognition, software engineering, human computer interface, like physical computing. So just like it's a really interesting mix. Really, anyone from Stanford can kind of go there and use it, and it just has this amazing history as well. So it's a really, really like amazing place for computer music in particular.
Very cool. Yeah. And for the listeners, we could give kind of like a brief overview of DSP, but like the idea of you have a sound wave, you can transform that sound wave. There are a bunch of different ways to transform that sound wave, like a Fourier transformation, but like the manipulation of that is so fluid and incredible, especially with, the digital realm, where basically like you can add in mathematically different shapes onto other shapes. I don't know. I'm trying my best to try and like help people visualize like what we do, I guess. But
yeah. I mean, it forms the basis of any type of plugin or any type of effect that you work with in the studio. So at some point, someone figured out how to make a filter with just moving around ones and zeros.
Yes.
And from code, it's like a whole big branch of signals and systems. And I think it's an interesting field because it's kind of a creative division of what's broader, like just a purely engineering sort of field. So
and I think there's like an interesting quasi metaphysical kind of aspect of this, of like manipulating waves. It's like some people think everything's waves, where you got like gravitational waves, you've got light waves, you got sound waves, and the sound ones are the ones that we can most easily manipulate and have fun with. The interdisciplinary thing is really cool because it provides access to music to some that might never really interact with music in a way that they would understand, or a way that they could manipulate and have fun with it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah. What do you think in terms of, how they've got these things where it's like, hear the black hole, or hear the earthquake, or hear the seizure, where they like pitch up like these super low frequencies. What do you think about that kind of stuff?
Yeah, like the whole sonification field.
Right.
I think it can be really cool. I've done some stuff related to that. Like I worked at a sonification lab where when I was at Columbia, we sonified seismic data.
Awesome.
And it was part of seismology department. So
Is it pitch shifting? Is it like frequency shifting? Like how are you actually, converting that in a way that feels,
converting
satisfying?
it.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, the basic idea is that you're taking some sort of data set that has some frequency content into it and then shifting it into a range that's perceivable to humans. So seismic data is all like super low frequency. You would never really hear it if you just put that signal straight through speakers. But then you like upsample it and then you do a bunch of effects, then you can really make it ideally representative of maybe how earthquakes feel. And so I think
cool.
the art
Yeah.
just kind of lies in filtering that data, which is sometimes not very perceptually interesting, into a way that makes it more engaging to humans. I mean, I think some people have this intention, but I think the idea is to make some phenomenon audible and audible specifically to humans. So some people take like bat,
Oh, cool.
bat like emit really weird
Like
high frequency,
supersonic. Yeah.
supersonic to like echolocate where their position, and then so they take that and then they shift it down. So I think it can be really cool. I mean, I find it to be more interesting stuff when it also pairs other kind of perceptual modalities with it. So like if you have this kind of experiential thing where you're like, we used to do these shows in the planetarium.
Cool. Yes.
Like, all these visualizations on the dome and then like crazy spatial audio. So that was really cool.
Yeah.
But it was to help people understand how earthquakes kind of spread. And I like that. I like that sort of stuff.
Yeah. I find it really fascinating. And I like the way you're putting it too, because it almost feels like translating between two very distinct languages where, the translator has to end up doing a lot of work to get from one to the next. It's not a direct thing. And it seems like that there's like a lot of trust and a lot of art to the sonification.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it really, especially for producers and whatnot, it is and I like the idea of being like a literary translation from one language to another. Yeah, that's a cool idea.
Yeah. That resonates. Pun intended. So how'd you end up in Copenhagen?
Interesting question, because it's not really a question, but yeah, I ended up here it's not somewhere where I ever was like, oh yeah, like I knew for sure I was going to be here 10 years ago.
Yeah.
I was finishing my PhD and I was done teaching and whatnot, and I was pretty much just had to write my dissertation. And I was going to France a lot because I kept having opportunities to do research residencies in France.
Okay.
So eventually I had kind of moved over there. I was going to Paris. I kind of lived in Paris half time for a year. And then I got like kind of a permanent research position in Lyon.
Cool.
And I was in Lyon for 2 years, but pretty much all during COVID as well. And then during that time, my PhD kind of got extended because of the pandemic. And I did like a arts kind of research residency in Copenhagen one summer. And I met some of the folks at one of the universities here. And I did a show at a museum here as part of that. And then it's a department called Sound and Music Computing at Aalborg University, Copenhagen, for anyone that wants to check it out.
Yeah, for sure.
Because they're really great people. They have a lab called the Multisensory Perception Lab. Cool. And they do all kinds of audio and AR, VR stuff. But awesome. One of the director of the department was like, hey, why don't you apply for a Fulbright grant? Fulbright's kind of this grant the US has with almost a lot of countries in the world where they'll grant you a year of research funding. So I applied for a Danish Fulbright grant and I got that for a year. So I got an extra year.
Yes.
And then I generally liked it here, and I had finished my PhD and then I got a postdoc. Yeah. So now I'm postdoc actually in Sweden. Cool. In Gothenburg. But I've been here 3 years now, actually 3.5. So yeah, quite a long time.
So how does that work with postdoc? I actually was really unfamiliar with that world. What are you like contributing? Like how does your professor that you're working with, are you able to do a lot of this remote? Is it kind of like you're focusing on your work and contributing to their research or contributing to exhibits in Sweden? Like how what are the mechanics of your postdoc?
Yeah, so my postdoc's not technically like an arts related postdoc. So it's at the Division of Acoustics. So
interesting.
It was actually a postdoc set up to do. I didn't really talk about this, but half of my PhD research was about conducting kind of behavioral studies in the music perception, specifically rhythmic perception. Cool. So I kind of got into doing this human perception research in sound. Yeah. And kind of related to music cognition. So yeah, this was a postdoc looking at how we perceive sound in space. So in immersive spaces. So they do a lot of stuff with spatial audio. And so this was set up. So we're looking at different aspects of how we synchronize to sound in space, how being in a spatial environment affects our perception of rhythm, how we form different auditory textures, or like different kind of immersive soundscapes from combining lots of different elements. So these sorts of things. But that kind of overlaps with a lot of my artistic work because I think that
naturally.
like trade is very soundscape oriented.
Yes.
So I think it's a nice way to do more technical research that allows me to talk about my work and contextualize it on that front.
That's really fascinating, and I'd love to dig in a little deeper into that if you're down.
Yeah.
The rhythmic thing that's a really interesting wrinkle and an interesting thing to think about. Is as you, if I'm following correctly, as you step into different spaces. Yes, your rhythmic perception very much changes. And there's a thing in David Byrne's book on music that I really love, and it talks about venue informing genre and how the concerto is the concerto in part because of the place. Early Renaissance or early church music sounds the way it does because early churches sound the way they do. And go all the way to CBGB, and like the music out of CBGB sounds like that because CBGB sounded like that, Curious, so like, does that latch on in any way to do some of that work that you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the kind of one of the headers for this postdoc, research-wise, when they applied for funding, was under the domain of what's called audible architecture.
Okay.
In acoustics in general, one concern when you design a space is the acoustics and like what materials you use, and that's not my research, but a lot of people study that sort of thing. So yeah, of course, like the design of a space and it's like the type of reverb it has and the materials they use is going to affect your perception. And so absolutely. And I think like in more of an arts context, or probably the way that David Byrne was thinking about it, it's kind of like, or I don't want to speak for him, of course, but just the idea that like the space in general is going to inform kind of the aesthetics of how you hear it. So even probably just like the smell of CBGB being like kind of like dirty and gross will probably like also play a role in your perceiving of that experience. So it's kind of maybe a more holistic way to understand how we perceive sound outside of just listening to. But yeah, the stuff I've been doing has been related to creating swarms. So a lot of my work is about, like I take one sound object and then I multiply it a bunch of times and then apply different types of control or interaction, and then they create sound, or they interact, they synchronize, they desynchronize. So we've been looking at how that kind of operates in physical space. Even if you just took like a bunch of snare drums and that you put them right in front of you, and then you started playing a rhythm or something, you had a ton of them playing a rhythm, and we were trying to synchronize to that. It would change based off of like the distance you are from them, the way it's spatialized around you. So we're kind of looking at those sorts of things.
Cool.
And then also just at what point we form auditory texture. So if you take a single sound like a raindrop, how many raindrops do you have to have in a space before it sounds like what we consider rainfall?
Cool. Right.
So you can lose that perception of discrete elements, and then it kind of is subsumed into this larger thing that we call an auditory texture. So like hail, rain, wind, like running water, these sorts of atmospheric sounds all kind of fall under this notion of the auditory texture. So
that's really cool. And that also, I understand the practical implications of that, because everything is resource constrained. And if you're making a video game or something, like I watched a really great glitch video of Super Mario 64, and how like if you did something, this little ghost would get bigger and bigger and bigger until it finally reversed, and then it went outside of the map and the game crashed because it hit the integer float value and just blew up the game. Okay. Awesome. Wow. Like little things like that. But like the same idea of how many raindrops do I need to put in if I'm doing Ghost of Tsushima or something like an immersive game with a lot of rain. You don't want to do infinite because your game will explode. You got to find the ideal value, and spatial audio, it makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we have a mode of hearing, like we start to hear sounds differently when there is a certain amount of complexity. So we actually like a lot of people that look into this from a more neurophysiological level have found like our brain switches modes.
Cool.
Because it's too complex for us to actually have to listen into every single raindrop. It makes more computationally efficient from like a neurological level just to think of that signal as a kind of like a stationary signal.
Interesting.
So we're kind of extracting certain features that just give it this quality of sounding like a soundscape, as opposed to sounding like a million different raindrops falling in front of you. So.
Yes. So the like taking it from like a series to like a cloud, like it like turns into this object. Yeah.
Exactly.
Very interesting. I think that sound is so fascinating, and there's so much that goes into it, especially like if you think of like a live festival where, and your snare drum example made me think of this, where sound is not that fast. And so if you're too far away from the other musician, there will be latency. And so if the stage is too big, people might not be playing the same song anymore. If the crowd is too big, people might not be listening at the same rate anymore. The latency effect, I think, is so fascinating and interesting to think about that in the case of the snare drum example you were giving.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I remember reading a paper and it was like looking at synchronization in some of the Berlin clubs.
Cool. Okay.
And like how they handled that aspect.
Yeah.
Because you have multiple rooms, multiple speakers, and I mean it's kind of like an acoustics nightmare in some ways, but
yes,
there was kind of like a decreased amount of like synchronization performance when speakers were further apart and more spatially arranged.
Okay.
There are some noticeable effects when you have spatial audio at play.
That's fascinating. I didn't know that. Yeah, I could see how. I mean, even some of my friends that have set up, Atmos studios and stuff like that. Yeah, the synchronization's always been an interesting, puzzle, and the placement of the listener in the room. All of these things, it compounds when you have more speakers pointed at you.
Absolutely, yeah.
Some of your work, especially on kind of the acoustic side, are you looking into like binaural like headphone effects as well? Because I'm sure that the implications for personal entertainment, gaming are really high. And I've liked some of the stuff that I've done with spatial audio. Just curious, I'm kind of like where science and acoustics are advancing in the binaural aspect, the headphone aspect.
Yeah. So some of the experiments that we're working with now, actually almost all of them have used this like binaural renderer that my advisor actually created, where you can just virtually position any number of sources in this program and then assign different sounds to them, and then you can move them in real time and blah blah blah, and use different like HRIRs to create reverbs and whatever. It's a really good way to test. Yeah, because we're creating perceptual studies, so we're often having people listen to stimuli and then respond to them. Okay, and we actually do have an anechoic chamber at the department, but
wow, I've never gotten one of those.
Yeah, you've never gone in?
No, I've never gone in an anechoic chamber. It's for the listeners. It's like those are like the craziest spaces in the universe. Could you talk about what that is? You probably actually even know how the math works. I don't know how the math works. It's just a bunch of little.
Well, I don't know I think designing them is probably really complex. But the general idea is that it's a room where there's no acoustic reflections, ideally, and so they have all these really weird kind of long triangular like foam absorbent cone things that are supposed to just take away any reflection, but then also ideally it's on a wire mesh, so then you're actually about 2 meters up from the ground.
Oh, I didn't know that. So it's like a room within a room, but with a wire mesh. I didn't know that. That's cool.
And then on below, because normally you'd get reflections from the ground too.
Naturally.
So you look down and you're kind of like in the middle, and it's kind of creepy. And then if you're really serious, they mechanically isolate the room, so the entire room is itself on springs, so you don't even get any like external noise being a factor into the room.
Wow.
But anyways, the reasoning for this is it's the best way to test any sort of acoustic device, because when you don't have reflections, and you get more it's a better way to analyze a lot of signals. So yeah, if we wanted to do a lot of our studies in that sort of room, it would be easier, but it's such a hard thing to just set up and
I'm sure
run. So we kind of use this like binaural renderer to do more or less the same, but it's not in a physical space. Yeah,
that's really cool. Yeah, I mean, and I guess another analogy is it's kind of like, people talk about, we tested this in a vacuum, or like the vacuum of space. Like the anechoic chamber is like our audio vacuum.
Exactly.
It's so cool. It's so cool. I want to go in there for sure. I feel like I'll freak out. Panic attack.
Yeah, it is. It's scary. Yeah, it's like but you actually hear, like John. Yeah, the whole John Cage thing where he went in and he's like, oh, it's not actually silent because I still feel the high pitch of my nervous system, and then like the low rumbling of like my blood circulation. And that's true. You really sense like how internal sound is to just your being when you go into one.
Yes. I even feel that going into just a well-treated recording studio. I can only imagine
Absolutely. It's very crisp. There's like this weird, or I don't know, it's crisp and dry. So I don't know. I don't really like.
Yeah.
It's fun to yell into the anechoic chamber.
Cool.
It's a good way to take out your anger.
The true void. The true void. Yeah. I like that. The primal scream into the anechoic chamber.
Exactly.
Yeah. That sounds like it sounds like the name of my next album.
Okay.
Good. Sorry to interrupt this very important broadcast, but it's time for one more advertisement for myself for this podcast. What I'm asking for is for you to rate it 5 stars, share it with your friends. This is like the most important thing for this podcast to grow. So if you want to do this, you go onto the podcast screen, right? You click on the ... on Spotify. Under there, it says rate show. and you go and you click it. 5 stars. If you could do that for me, that's the best way for the algorithms and all this stuff to share it out with the world. I know that it's a lot to ask, but if you could please just hit those 3 dots and then a 5-star, it would really help us out and helps us, get the word out and spread the love of music. So thank you. If you're listening on YouTube, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Thank you so much. And here's the rest of the episode. I love that we live in a time that we can create things that no one has ever heard before. Like that just entirely artificial new modalities of sound. Like how cool is that? Just as a fundamental artistic thing is like that's the first time anybody's ever experienced that. That's crazy. It's amazing.
That's my favorite. Yeah. I think that, to be honest, that's really what drives like a lot of my work is like, I want to know what like this sound sounds like. Cause I think maybe you never hear like this many gun triggers in a room going off it. Or something just curious to create something that might never have been experienced before. Yeah.
And I mean, I love the emotional audience perspective of those kind of things too. Because like every sound has an emotional memory or something attached to it. And then you amplify that through scale or change it through the conversation of these different things. And it's so fascinating to see what kind of emotion that elicits from your audience.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything that makes sound has some cultural, probably some cultural connection to it, especially if it's just a daily object that we use or not, So I think just kind of subverting those expectations or reconfiguring them in some way allows us just to look at the world differently through that object and through sound specifically. Yeah.
That's very cool. How do you feel kind of unveiling a new project or kind of like watching the audience experience it for the first time? Like what does that feel like as the creator?
Yeah. Well, no, it's honestly the most rewarding thing. It's my favorite thing when someone's looking at one of my pieces and, they don't know that I made it and they're like talking about it. And you get to, it's like a really, I guess it's harder to experience that when you're performing music because you're always like one side, but
yes.
I guess if you could hear a song on the radio and you hear people like listening and like talking about that would be like similar.
Right.
But no, it's great. I mean, like you never know what people are going to think and the associations they have. And I'm always so nervous because all my stuff moves. So like things could break and then it's like game over. I can't be like fixing a set screw on the floor, like the opening day. You know? So I'm always so nervous, but if nothing breaks, I'm always feel like it's kind of a success. I have a good track record so far I just had this installation come down in Stockholm and it was all these like window blinds. You can see it on my Instagram.
Yeah, I see that.
That are moving cool. And I was so scared that they were going to fall and there was nobody like they were gone for a month in the gallery and it was just in the window in the front. And I was like, oh no, it's going to fall and create a fire. And I'm like, it's just going to be like, I'm going to burn down like Stockholm Center and it's going to be terrible. But it stood the test of time. So I was really happy about that. And I just have to be really kind of OCD about finding it in a way so that there's lots of fail safes and whatnot.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, you almost have to be like an aerospace engineer or something to be like, this needs to survive the entire run.
Yeah. And anything that moves eventually will wear down and break. It's just part of life. So
entropy.
Entropy. Yeah, for sure.
So, what are some of the things that you're kind of excited in the space? How about some other artists that you're really into, or things that you might want to share so people could kind of dig deeper into the world as you see it, art as you see it, kind of your influences, your friends?
Yeah, that is a good question. I mean, to be honest, like the music I actually listen to now is
please.
Like, I feel like I am not the best at like discovering tons of really cool new music stuff. I mean, I listen to a lot of like Bach and
cool. Yes.
And jazz that I like have since for like 25 years, you know, and so I'm kind of like an old man in that respect.
That's perfectly valid and worth shouting out too, because I think there are plenty of people that have not kept their appointment with Bach.
I feel bad. I feel a little bad because I should be a lot more like up to date with that sort of thing. But I see a lot of interesting stuff, and like I think when I see concerts, I always see interesting things. But I just don't necessarily like dedicated listening to a lot of more contemporary stuff. But I want to get better at that because I'm just at a period of my life where that's not happening. And I've been working on this show it's supposed to open in Gothenburg in about a month.
Cool.
So just listen a lot to. It sounds really trite and like cliche, but I really do just like listen to the world when I'm walking around. Like, I think just reminding yourself that there's inspiration and interesting things to be heard, or just even to put yourself in that frame of listening and remind yourself to put yourself in that frame
Yes.
is really important. And I find myself getting really bogged down in the way I think I can recenter or kind of refocus on the present is just by listening to what's around me. And even now there's like, I'm in my studio and there's someone drilling in the other room. Yeah, I guess I would say that that's kind of what was on my mind.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah, and I like that advice too, and I've been trying to take that of just I got a little like Zoom recorder and then a binaural microphone that I stick in
nice.
basically like into my ears. So it's really only truly binaural for me, but I'm making it for me anyway. It's been fun because it opens me up. I always carry it around in my backpack. I've got it right here.
Cool.
And then
That's awesome.
this little, and so like every time I go to nature backpacking or whatever, they're really funny. You know, I mean, it's like this is like $150 or something like that. You know,
Very cool.
So I don't feel bad about it taking it into the middle of nowhere into some dusty wilderness.
Right.
But even just the mentality shift when I bought it, I don't even need to use it as much. It's just that like opening up, putting the antenna up, you hear the birds more, you hear verticality of trees. That was something that I never perceived before.
Oh my gosh.
You know?
So cool.
Yeah.
I love that.
Like, I don't know. I know that you know this super well, but for the listeners, the spatial audio thing has been really interesting because it made me kind of more aware of what the power spots are in hearing, like the things that are easiest to perceive, and verticality above your head is not super easy to spoof or super easy to. So, but when you do experience it, when you're like underneath a 60-foot tree with the bird that's really loud way up above you, it's that feeling of like, okay, that's what the goal is. That's if I wanted to, do that thing, that's the mark that I need to hit of
Absolutely.
verticality. Yeah.
Yeah. I like the idea of like augmented listening, it's like, kind of think of ourselves as our auditory system as just being like, oh, it's like so perfect the way it is, or like we're always trying to like recreate an experience. But I think the people, or maybe people and like designers that are trying to like enhance modes of listening that aren't just like, oh, let's recreate the concert hall in this way, but let's create an experience that's like not necessarily how you would experience it in the concert hall, but it's like a weirder, more dynamic experience than that. Yeah, there's this. Yeah, I was just at this conference and they were kind of talking about this style of designing sound that's not just about reproduction of an acoustic signal as we would experience in real life, but a kind of augmented reality version of that.
Yes.
And I do think that is a cool idea, and probably there's a lot of interesting stuff that will happen in the future because of it.
I'm excited. I'm excited as a creator to use those tools wherever they go, because it's super fun. I think a big thing that I've been noticing too is, and it goes back to your point of like swarms and like clouds of objects rather than individual objects. It's harder to localize things when there's too much going on. Like,
right.
If there's a full mix and then I'm like, I'm going to throw this behind your head, I don't know if the listener will ever notice that there's something behind their head.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
100%.
It's like we only have so much processing power, and but like if you put the spotlight, and I think that's what the moment was for me with that super tall tree and the bird. There was very little going on. There was like a stream to my left, a little bit of wind through the trees, and then a bird really, really high up. And that was it. That was the only sound.
Right.
And that's why I was able to be like, there's a bird really high above me right now. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it is. It's all about, I think, like little just differences. And
Yes.
so if you have too many differences, nothing is like that different because everything is like so different. I don't know if that makes sense. But
That makes sense. No, I get it.
Yeah, even with spatial audio, like with these types of sounds I was talking about, these auditory textures, you literally only need like 4 channels, just like kind of a quadraphonic setup. And that's more or less indistinguishable from having like 40 around you.
Really?
So there's something about these really dense, large swarm-like sounds that just immediately give us the presence of it being immersive or enveloping. And so, yeah, I mean, it's something to keep in mind, I guess, when you are having like a lot of things in a mix, because our spatial acuity is going to be compromised when there's a lot more stuff going on. So
that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's also part of my, it's not really disappointment, but at least like the limitations of Dolby Atmos for music, where it's cool. There's like good stuff. I like using it. I like mixing with it. But game audio or like textural audio hits harder because it's just like it's sparser or it's more. I don't know, like the music thing of it. You're in the center of the stage and there's stuff all around you. It still kind of sounds like a mix, though. Like
yeah,
it still is kind of stereo, really. Like I don't know.
Right.
There's stuff flying over my head, and that's neat. It feels like a Pink Floyd concert. That's cool. But like, there's still like a lot of bass and guitar and low mids that are all pretty much being beamed into the top of my head at center. So I don't know. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, I do. Yeah, there's something like disorienting. Yeah, I don't know, just like something very psychologically uh interesting, I think, about sounds that aren't yeah, when there isn't that pressure to make things in that specific format too.
yeah,
So like I think you're like all the like weird procedural audio stuff they do, or like
yeah,
generative audio in gaming, that stuff's really cool because it's also just not always super physical. I mean, it's
yes,
like
yeah,
the engine is it's supposed to be physical, but like it's kind of not how it would sound like. But that actually makes it more interesting because it's more of like a psychological effect.
yes, right.
Kind of how I think of it, at least. Like it's something we're not used to hearing, so then it changes we're kind of like not used to that, and it allows us to maybe, I don't know, hear it in a different way.
That's
So,
cool. That's cool. And I like the way you're thinking of it too, where it's almost like deltas, right? Like you got the zero value and then you got everything around you. And then like, how are these things changing from that zero value? And it's the same way that we were talking about, transforming audio and changing one thing to another, or soundification, changing something imperceivable to something perceivable. That type of mentality in creation, I think, is kind of rare. And that is a very fundamental and freeing kind of way, I think, of looking at just audio generation.
yeah, I totally agree. And like I don't come from a strong audio engineering doing mastering and
Yeah.
recording, so much so I can't really comment too much on on that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But I do think there are really interesting things to come from. I mean, there's so many tools available to people, and just more and more, and yeah, with AI and
Yeah.
like everything happening, it's a pretty exciting time, I think, for production.
I agree. And I mean, and that's my world. And so the stuff that I'm using or the aha moment for me really was during the pandemic, stopping thinking about notes and thinking about frequencies. And that opened everything up where now, you have a bass guitar. There are harmonics extending above that root note, and there are subharmonics extending below. You can manipulate those things in a million different ways in the digital space, where you can add in a whole bunch of subharmonics, and you can change the fundamental nature of what a bass is. Or like on one of my songs, Melodyne, which is usually used for pitch correction, it also has a crazy powerful harmonic manipulator within it. And so I can change the formant, as in the mouth shape of my background vocals, but I can also change the harmonic structure of my vocals, which is crazy to be like, oh, my second order harmonic is just gone now.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound like me anymore. It sounds like an alien, but it's like,
Yeah, and that's all it takes is just taking out like a single component of that spectrum, and it will change our perception of that as sounding human.
yeah,
Yeah, and that's a really powerful thing to be able to do. And in the past, that was so out. So
it's so hard to pull off. Like, how do you, I don't know how you do it. Maybe there's a way with analog filters. I don't know. Maybe.
yeah, there probably was. They did have a lot of weird stuff that would just happen, and I think even still just like by accident.
Yeah.
And so a lot of it is just some of the coolest outcomes are just from the happy accidents sort of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Totally. And I mean, and that's how a lot of synthesis, it's like using the same tools that a lot of synthesis is built on, of like, you have a sine wave, you change the harmonics, and now it sounds a little bit more like a flute, because it's like mimicking the harmonic structure and series of a flute. It's like taking that same principle and then putting it to the human voice. It just feels so foreign and bizarre and cool, and it's just like, there's a sound that not a ton of people have heard before.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the founder of Karma, John Chowning, who like developed FM synthesis, he's actually still around, and like
Cool.
an amazing person.
I think I recently just watched a video of him talking
Oh,
about
did you?
FM synthesis. That
Yeah,
would
did
make it
you
around.
see the one he was saying how it was like an ear discovery?
Yes, yeah,
Like,
I watched that video.
yeah,
Yep,
yeah,
that was right.
exactly. And
Yep.
I mean, I've seen him. I just saw him in Copenhagen actually
Cool.
a few months ago. He did like a retrospective concert here, but
Awesome. Small world.
he's like a really great mentor and person who's just made that program at Stanford amazing. But he gives his talk all the time, and he presents the way he came across this stuff. And
Okay.
FM existed before it was applied in the audio realm, of course. But then like hearing the way in which you've seen the vibrato effect, like where you have the right kind of harmonic structure, and then you apply the vibrato, and then it starts immediately just sounds like a human voice.
Yeah.
So yeah, all those things that was like just done from kind of like somewhat heuristically, and just
Cool.
trying it and then hearing it and then trying it and trying else. And of course there's a math to it, but yeah, I know. I like that approach of just
Me too.
trying things, accidentally stumbling on something and it ends up being a very, very significant development in the future.
Human history, yeah.
Audio. Yeah, human
Seriously.
history, yeah.
Yeah. And I like that too, because I think it makes it a little more approachable where, you know, if you have to approach everything like we were talking serialism or, you know, from a very theoretical mathematical way, rather than just being like, what sounds cool? And then you can backfill, you know, both are good. Both are certainly good. But I think the one hand of it being an ear discovery allows for more people to enter into that frame of thinking, enter into discovery, synthesis, and, you know, just sound creation.
Definitely. And it's really rewarding, I think, too, because you're like, do this thing and it takes a long time. And then, or you're like working and then it's like not working out. And then you just like do one little thing and it's like, oh, wow. Like, how did I get there? You know,
Yes.
like, yeah.
Totally.
So it feels like it's worth it, but then you don't always figure out something that's cool. Sometimes you mess around for hours and hours and weeks or whatever. And then like nothing comes out and you're like, well, all right, I guess I'll keep going.
Yep.
Or
Exactly.
not.
Exactly. I mean, that's how I feel with most of my music creation and mixing as well, of just, you know where you're trying to get to, you're going to apply a bunch of things along the way, you will make some wrong turns, and then sometimes it will be, like, mixing also kind of became an aha thing of, it's not just the one track, it's not just the bus track, it's the combination of everything down the chain all working a little bit together that creates something that sounds good.
100%. Yeah.
And it's like, before I was thinking like liberal application of cool vibe onto kick drum. It's like, no, the way that the kick drum hits everybody else and interacts with everybody else is really where the magic sauce is. And so it's in that requires a more flexible way of thinking and more like inductive learning rather than deductive. You know, it's less procedural. It is more holistic. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love that idea.
Yeah.
It's really interesting to hear people that like do what you do talk about this stuff, because I feel like it really does apply to anyone in the creative process with sound. You know, it's like similar ways in which you instantiate chains, you know, I guess in a sense like a, you know, like literal signal chain, but you know, just like an idea and then you would add another idea and then it has to flow in some direction, and the earlier idea you have is going to affect the ones down the line or vice versa. And so I think it's just an interesting way to talk about it. So
cool. I'm glad. And that's part of the reason why I like doing this show, is that it's fun pointing at, because you can never like exactly say what it is. Music is so nebulous. Audio is so nebulous. But you can kind of like draw a circle around the bullseye, sort of. And I think in all of these different conversations, we kind of all are indicating towards a thing that we cannot really speak about. It's like looking at the sun. But it's fun because it's cross-functional and cross-medium.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
definitely.
So on that note, I have one last question for you, Nolan. This is what I ask all of my guests. Why do you love music? What is it about it?
Wow. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Why do I love music? I think I would say that maybe like to distill it into, which is really hard, but to distill into like one, maybe like core idea, just what I don't know, off the top of my head. But I think it goes back to this idea of remaining present. So there is something about music that immediately puts you into the present moment, you know, makes you kind of mindful. And, you know, again, that sounds pretty trite and whatnot, but I do think it allows us access to a kind of like bodily, or kind of just like a way of engaging with the world that's just focused in the present. And whether that be like sound or just like a random sound or Bach or whatever it is, I do find myself listening to both of those things in a similar way that's kind of really focused in the moment, focused in the body, focused on listening. And maybe that's the core thing for me.
That's a great answer. It's a great answer. I really like that. And I agree. And I also like that too, because that's a surprising one. A lot of people have focused on opportunities that it's given them or emotions that it gives them. But I feel like that even cuts a little bit deeper of just, it makes you feel more alive and human and connected to the universe. And I think that's always a good thing.
It's a good, especially in today's world, and
true.
You know, with everyone being on the phones and everything like that. So, and I'm in no way like not doing that.
Totally. Same. No, I mean, like I was talking about going to the wilderness, like the first day of backpacking was like phone withdrawal syndrome. You know, I was like, I'm so like, I need to be more stimulated. Yeah. If you walk far enough.
You walk far enough. Yeah. It's probably good to do that. I've been wanting to do that more, to be honest, to do
It's really good. It's really good. And I mean, you got great forests and stuff you could go check out, or you could go to Germany and just have a
not great weather all the time.
That's
but
fair. That's fair. Not quite California. Yeah, fair.
Yeah, that's true.
So where can people learn more about you, reach out to you, see your work?
Go to my website. It's just nolanlem.com, or my Instagram. I post a lot of stuff there too. That's probably the two best ways.
Perfect. Well, be sure to do that, everybody. And thank you, Nolan. Really appreciated this super fun conversation.
Yeah, thank you as well. Yeah, and take care.